Happy Thursday to you all. Welcome to Encouragement from Pastor Phil. I'm glad that you joined us. You know, we talked recently about the three classical practices of the Lenten season. One is prayer, the other is fasting, and the third is almsgiving. Well, I want to add a fourth great practice to those. It's called forgiving one's enemies. I find this keeps coming up in readings for the Lenten season. You know, there is enough. Well, let me begin by reading a scripture. Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not kill, and whoever murders shall be liable to the judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to the judgment. I want to unpack that in just a few moments, but yeah, there's enough anger in our country today to light up the whole eastern seaboard. You know, we're sitting on a lot of unresolved anger and frustrations, etc. And we see this played out in so many different ways if you watch the news. Well, what is anger if we construe it as a sin? I believe it was Thomas Aquinas who defined the deadly sin of anger like this. He said, the deadly sin of anger is the irrational or excessive desire for revenge. Let me say that again. The irrational or excessive desire for revenge. Now, that's a very interesting definition, isn't it? You know, let's say we're harmed by somebody and, we feel naturally this desire to get back at them for what they've done. And when that desire becomes excessive or irrational, that's when we get into the deadly sin of anger. You know, Dante saw this deadly sin of anger as something that needed to be purged. Uh, he said that the the angry have to go through smoke because anger has that effect on us. It chokes us and blocks our vision. Now, the deadly sin of anger needs to be distinguished from a legitimate passion for justice. For instance, um, Jesus in the temple, turning over the tables of the money changers. He obviously was angry, but his was a justified indignation. Or let's say Martin Luther King Jr., he saw the terrible offenses done to his people, and he felt the need to right those wrongs. He was filled with a righteous indignation. Now, now that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And if you're filled with righteous indignation for a just cause, then you do your work of social justice with a passion. But we're talking about today the irrational or excessive desire for revenge that produces a choking smoke in our lives. So I want to talk to you about practicing the art of forgiving your enemies today. You know, this was central to the teaching of Jesus. I'll tell you a wonderful reading for the Lenten season is the Sermon on the Mount. Actually, it's a good reading for any time. Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Um, and as we just read a moment ago, Jesus says in chapter 5, verse 21, you've heard it said of those ancient times, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to the judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. You see, Jesus just goes right to the heart of the matter, doesn't he? He just goes deep down to our interiority, to what lies behind the sin of killing, this anger that wells up within us. That anger has to be addressed. A tad later in this chapter 5, Jesus gives us what I think is the theological and rhetorical high point of the Sermon on the Mount, and it revolves around his teaching on loving our enemies. He says in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Why? Why? For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. You see, in the act of loving our enemies, we most imitate God, because God is love right through. Love is all he is. Love is all he has. That's all he can give us, love. What is the greatest test of love? The greatest test of love is that we will the good of the other, especially for those who are not going to be good back to us. Loving our enemies is so central to the Christian life. So let me give you a few examples of, so I can concretize this. And what does it look like to practice forgiveness? Well, let me see if I can give you 3 examples that come to mind. I was thinking recently about Cardinal Joseph Bernardine, who was in Chicago. It's somebody that made a big impression on me with, especially when he talked about being pro-life consistently, that is across the board. You know, some people are anti-abortion, but pro-capital punishment, or pro-war. And he talked about being pro-life consistently across the stream. So he made a big impression on me in that regard. But Cardinal Joseph Bernardine, and this was back before 2002, when the sexual abuse scandals was on the national radar scene. This was back mid 90s, I think it was. Cardinal Bernardine was accused of sexual misconduct with a young man by the name of Stephen Cook. Do you remember this story? Everybody was shocked at this news. And so Cardinal Bernardine met with a large group of people and spoke about how devastating this accusation was, and how that he would daily, in his private chapel, um, prostrate himself before the altar and beg God to take this away from him. How can this be happening to me? He thought. Well, it was about a month later. I think this is around 1994. Stephen Cook, the young man who accused him, dropped the charges and said that they were false. And Bernardine was exonerated. Now, let me ask you, who could blame Joseph Bernardine if he had said to about Stephen Cook, get the heck out of here. I don't ever want to see your face again. I have nothing more to do with you. Or we probably would have praised the cardinal if he had just quietly moved on. But what he did was he flew to, I think it was Cincinnati, where the young Stephen Cook was dying. He was dying of AIDS. And Cardinal Bernardine took with him a Bible. He gave young Cook a Bible, and he, in Catholic fashion, anointed Stephen Cook, offered last sacraments to him, and prayed for him. You see, it was a moment when you could see the Sermon on the Mount in action. Stephen Cook had deeply harmed the cardinal, but the cardinal forgave him. He loved his enemy. That's the practice I'm talking about. Or another one, and this may have happened around the same time. Do you remember the Amish family that in Pennsylvania who, got around on by horse and buggy? Well, there were these two parents and their teenage son who were on a ride one day, and behind them was an automobile filled with teenagers who were annoyed at this slow-moving vehicle in front of them, this horse and buggy. And so they shook their fist and they screamed out expletives and shouted at this Amish family, and they drove around them real fast. And in the process, one of the teenagers in that vehicle took a stone or a brick, and he fully intended to hit the horse, but he missed the horse, and it hit the young teenage son, and it killed him. It was a heart-wrenching story. Do you remember this story? I mean, here are some good, innocent people just out for a ride on their horse and buggy. And the teenage kid, for no good reason, is killed. Well, the parents attended the trial of the young man who threw the stone. And as a matter of fact, they testified on his behalf that he might not be sent to prison. But the young man was convicted and he was sent to prison. But these parents on a regular basis would visit that young man and care for him. You see, this is the gospel in all of its drama, all of its strangeness, all of its surprise. Well, there's another story about Amish people. This one happened, I think, around the year 2006, 2007. This again was in Pennsylvania. I think it was Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. There was a man, a milkman, a man whose name was Charles Roberts, who drove the milk truck and made deliveries of milk to this school. He stormed into a little one-room schoolhouse and shot 10 young girls, killing 5 of them, and then he killed himself. Now that old school was demolished after that, and a new school was built, but the new school was closed on the 1-year anniversary of that shooting, and families gathered for prayer. We all watched on national television those Amish people expressing forgiveness toward the killer and his family. These Amish people attended Charles Roberts' funeral right after they had attended their own children's funerals. And they even donated money to the killer's wife and her 3 children. You know, because they made a decision to follow Jesus and forgive their enemy, not holding grudges, they were then in a better position. They were better able to concentrate on the work of their own healing, their own grief work. Incredible story, just absolutely incredible. Well, I've given you some dramatic stories there, examples of loving one's enemies. We're told in Scripture to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to pray for those who maltreat us. Let's say somebody has harmed you and you're naturally feeling revenge. Maybe that revenge becomes irrational and excessive. You know, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? Well, you do it through the practice of forgiveness. You practice the art of forgiving one's enemy. Now, I'm talking to you today as humbly as I know how. Don't think I'm on some kind of high horse here. I'm talking to myself as I'm talking to you. We're told to forgive our enemies. Now, there's something here that I want you to think of an enemy. Hey, we all have one or more. If you don't think so, let's put it this way. I was talking to a group one time on forgiveness, and this woman came up to me and told me that, well, I don't have any enemies. And then I told her that the word enemies in the Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke, meant someone who is out of step with you. She said, oh, in that case, I've got lots of enemies, which we all do. There are plenty of people who are out of step with us. Think of someone. We all have someone. Let's not pretend that we don't. Here's a good Lenten practice. Do something to express love and forgiveness to this person or those people. It could be a telephone call. It could be an email. It could be a visit, or maybe just a prayer. Maybe that's all you can muster is a prayer. But don't just think about doing something. Do something. Practice it. Now, here's something that was revealed to me some time ago that has been helpful to me in this verse 44 of chapter 5, Matthew. Love your enemies and pray for them. Just reverse that order. Pray for them. If you pray for them, eventually you can love them. You can will their good. If you'll begin with prayer. My mother said something one time, as far as I know, it was original with her. She said, you can't hate somebody you can pray for. Because if you persist in prayer about this person, somewhere down the line, the Lord will soften your heart. The Lord will melt your heart. And one of these days, you will find yourself genuinely wishing your enemy well. Well, there you have it. The practice of forgiving our enemies. I think it's an incredible practice for the Lenten season, and I hope that you will join me in doing it. Thank you. Amen.